I like to move around, but if the AV doesn't work, I will stick to the podium. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. So there's a lot of words in there, but hopefully you'll get a feel for what I intend. 2 years ago, a few of us were getting much more concerned about our increased dependence on connected technology in areas that affected public safety and human life. We were also concerned about, maybe some of you are as well, the increased criminalization of research and more fear towards the talent pool in this room. And we were also concerned, if you saw what Jericho and I have been doing with Researching Anonymous and activism, was basically that the increased adoption of technology was coming into tremendous tension and conflict with civil liberties and our values and with technology winning. So we essentially looked high and deep in the federal government and different governments in the world. We looked for the adults in the room and we couldn't find any. So the origin of the name was that the Cavalry isn't coming. No one's gonna come fix this for you. And if you're concerned about any of those things, body, mind, or soul, then you could be a voice of reason and technical literacy. And the name wasn't, to describe us, it was to describe something that you would decide to do, that you're gonna be your own Cavalry and be that voice of reason and technical literacy, be an ambassador and a teacher to public policymakers, the general public, and the affected industries. So over time, we've realized there's a lot of people trying to do good work on these fronts. So we focused squarely on the one that most people were ignoring, which was public safety and human life in cars, medical devices, industrial control systems, and the Internet of Everything. So that's the genesis of the idea. And we know that eventually people will figure this out, but the key was we wanted to be safer sooner. And the real killer app there wasn't hacking skills. It was empathy skills. It was learning how to talk to people that aren't in the echo chamber at their level in their terms. And that's why sometimes we'll say cyber, because when you're in Washington and you don't say cybersecurity, they don't know what you're talking about. I don't know, I really, several chords were struck in my heart listening to the previous keynote because of the journey, right? I think if you think about where you started or how long you've been doing this, the things that I thought were important when I began are nowhere near the same list I would have today. And one of my biggest lessons it took me way too long to learn is that any strategy we have that depends on a change in human nature is going to fail. Everybody's motivated differently. So, I got into hacking and hacking culture because I want to make the world a safer place. That's my primary motive. My secondary is I like to take things apart and put them back together. It's the curiosity. But for other people, it's glory and ego. For other people, it's financial gain. So instead of starting my motives onto others, what I realized is we're all going to have different ones, and if we can find some way to have some common ground, we get more things done. And I think that's why the rugged DevOps stuff is working more than a bunch of people trying to throw themselves on the tracks to stop progress in the development operations, cultural changes. So once we figured out that developers want to be on time and on budget, and ops people want service availability and fast mean time to identify and repair, and business people want something else, once we started talking in their terms and finding ways to help them do so, we became significantly more effective. So I don't know what motivates you, but it's one of the top questions I ask now when I go to HackerCons is, how did you get into hacking? And why do you stay in it this long, right? What is it about it that attracts you? And knowing why you do something is so much more important than what you did or how you did it, because it's going to drive our actions. So for me, I hate this phrase. I don't know about you guys. I really, really hate it. And I can't even hear it the way it's intended. The guy that wrote this, Andreessen, he said, basically he was saying that no matter what you do, you're becoming a software company, and that software is the last mile of innovation and differentiation. So John Deere doesn't call themselves a tractor company anymore. They're a software delivery platform. And GE doesn't call themselves, industrial company anymore. They call themselves industrial software. When I hear this, and perhaps this resonates with some of you, is software is not eating the world, it's infecting the world, right? It's like a virus. If you were to look at this from the moon, we're putting software and connectivity and Bluetooth onto every single thing in your home, right? So when I think about it this way, I'm deeply concerned at the idea that if all code is vulnerable and we're putting code everywhere, we're making everything vulnerable. Now clearly we wouldn't do this if it was just a virus, right? We're smarter than that. So this isn't quite the right metaphor either, but I can't help but shake this instinct. So then I was fixing my deck, and I had to go buy nails. That's galvanized metal there. Does anybody know why you galvanize metal? so it doesn't rust. Does anybody know what you lose in the trade? Yeah, it makes it brittle. So I had to buy more because I bent half of them, right? So then I'd almost like us to look at software and connectivity in a similar way, that when we want the benefit of rust proofing or whatnot, or the convenience, it's worth it, but when we need the tensile strength, it's not a good idea. And I think to blindly assume that we can put software and connectivity on everything, like an insulin pump, or a car, or an airplane so you can fly it sideways, those are not always going to be the right choice. And we've in a mode in history right now where we think everything's better with bacon and everything's better with Bluetooth, right? So speaking to that, I hate the logo trend, right? You got, some of them are worse than others. Shell shock wasn't that bad, but denim was pretty bad. But aside from being the era of logos, this was a real wake-up call for people outside the echo chamber, that for them, this was a real shock to the system, because they had long been told that with many eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, and open source is this magical, infallible unicorn that can't ever have flaws. And I think the real wake-up calls were plural. Number one, I don't think anybody had any idea how pervasively dependent upon OpenSSL the world was. And you'll see some of the examples in a moment. I actually think, even though we beat up on this, it was a pretty phenomenal response. It was less than 2 years between the introduction of the bug and people finding it. That's pretty good if you look at some other comparables. Number two, they fixed most of the stuff within the first month. Rob Graham did a scan of the whole internet and found what was listening. He found 600,000 hits on day one. Within a month, 300,000 of them fixed. That's actually pretty good, right? 50% fix rate, not bad. The sad news, though, is that he kept scanning it once a month, and there's still over 300,000. The number's actually growing. So we're under 50% fix rate, even a year and a half later. And one of the reasons for that is a lot of the things that depended upon OpenSSL are unpatchable. They're not just unpatched, they're unpatchable. They're embedded systems that are both vulnerable, exposed, and unremediatable. Some of the ones, were just websites and you had to maybe rotate your keys and it was a little bit of an inconvenience. Some of these were Siemens industrial control systems that are meant to be deployed for 30 years. Now, I call out Siemens actually as a compliment, because of all the industrial controls players affected by Heartbleed, they admitted it and they were patchable. Many of their competitors were neither, right? So this is nauseating for a lot of us, but it's a real game changer, and it's gotten a lot of attention from parts of the industrial IoT and whatever. Now, there's been confirmed presence of OpenSSL vulnerabilities in cars. Codenomicon's on record finding it with their fuzzers. It's in a lot of the home IoT. It's certainly in industrial controls, as I alluded to, and it's actually been found to be exploitable in medical devices. And Cavalry's been doing a significant amount of work with the Food and Drug Administration and others to try to get on top of this. So again, while nauseating to our community, it's been a very, very useful watershed moment for causing a good gut check at looking at what the IoT is, right? And then shell shock actually has been much, much worse, right? Because in a lot of the embedded operating systems. So if you heard of the Cavalry, I just mentioned that, but essentially all we wanted to do was ensure that the trust that we place on connected technologies is worthy of said trust. So we've been using much more collaborative approach. We wanted to collect existing researchers and research instead of inventing from whole cloth. We want to connect them to each other, because a lot of us don't collaborate that much or talk to each other. We wanted to collaborate with the other researchers, but also with willing parties and industries, and we found willing allies in pretty much every car company, every tier 1 supplier, every medical device manufacturer. And they want the help, they need the help, and sometimes they need external voices to get their internal decision makers over the finish line. And then we wanted to catalyze those safer, sooner outcomes in ways that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Now, one of the vehicles, pardon the pun, we did for this is on our first birthday at DEF CON last year, we published a 5-star automotive cyber safety framework. And it was an open letter to the CEOs of all the car companies in Reuters. So we tried to get really big headline attention, and we did. And what we essentially said, and we probably should have simplified this, but we said, look, if cars are now computers on wheels or computer networks on wheels, you're inheriting quite a bit of the risk and reward of our domain. And we said, you're masters of your domain, and you've been making cars safer over the last 50 years. We're masters of our domain, and now that our domains have collided, we will have safer outcomes sooner if we work together. Here's a framework to do so. So we have this, these 5 things that we expected. You must be this tall to ride the Internet of Things. If you can't handle these, if you're not ready for failure, you're going to be in a very bad position. So these are a couple slides we took to Detroit and we took to the auto industry to kind of explain what we meant by this. Now, my first assertion, and hopefully no one in here would disagree with this, but I said all systems fail, right? We don't have to get into FUD and dead babies and all sorts of fear-based scenarios. We can simply talk about the reality of systems engineering. All systems fail, right? Failure is normal and predictable. And if you remember this is just a screenshot from a really awesome graphic on Information Is Beautiful about how many lines of code there are in different things over time. And we know from computer science that there's a defect rate per KLOC, right? Per 1,000 lines of code. There's a certain range, whether humans are writing the code or computers are writing code, there's a certain steady state flaw range for thousands of lines of code. Modern vehicles are over 10 million lines of code. Your Windows operating system is about 1.5 million. Right, so significant potential for flaws, and it takes one, right? Now the presence of software isn't the issue, it's the number and range and new types of remote attack surface that we keep adding, right? It used to just be tire pressure sensors or a physical onboard diagnostics port, not old dirty bastard, but onboard diagnostics port. Then it was near field or your keyless entry, but now every Chevy has 4G LTE Wi-Fi hotspots standard. And it kills me because they said, well, people want to play on their iPads. I'm like, I have a 4G LTE Wi-Fi hotspot right here and it can't disable my brakes. This is elective attack surface being marketed as a differentiator. And now it's become a competitive parity thing where nearly every car is going to have to put in a 4G LTE Wi-Fi hotspot on the same CAN bus as everything else. So this is, with this trend, it's not so much the potential for defects per 1,000 lines of code and over 10 million lines of code and growing. One of the Ford guys told me they have 72 different ECUs in their lowest model car. So, well, it's actually a misnomer to call it a computer on wheels. It's a network. And the one that really should bug you, since they're all putting web browsers in their car, is the third-party app stores, right? So imagine any code running in any memory space having full unfettered access to the CAN bus and critical systems. So typically when you get them to that point, they said, well, Josh, there's no money in it, right? Nobody would hack us. Who would target my grandma, right? And sure, fair enough, but the first adversary in every single threat modeling exercise should be good old Murphy, right? It's not just adversaries, it's accidents and adversaries. Some of the deaths in the unintended acceleration case, that was a glitch. It wasn't, elite hacksaws from APT China, right? It was glitches. So now when you work with the government folks, they're far less concerned about the Russian mafia doing ransomware to start your engine, which is a clearly obvious use case to monetize computer systems in cars. Please give us a Bitcoin to start your engine. But they're actually much more worried about ideological adversaries. And given how easy it is to do some of these, despite what Chris and Charlie will tell you, it's not about can, and I hope they wouldn't hurt me. It's really more a matter of, I want to know they can't. And we haven't set up these systems with safeguards and air gaps and analog controls. Essentially, and one of my favorite lines from Dan Geer is that on the internet, every sociopath is your next door neighbor. So it's not about hoping what most people would do. It's about one, there was no money in the Charlie Hebdo stuff. There was no money in the Boston Marathon bombings. There was no money in the kid shooting up his school in Connecticut. As long as there are people that want to inflict their will upon others, and we're giving them new ways to do that, we have to factor those into the math. So what the 5-star really is, when I finally started explaining it to my mother-in-law and my neighbor, it's 5 postures towards failure. 2 of them are policy, 3 of them are technical. It's tell all your customers how you'll avoid failure. Tell third-party researchers you'll take help avoiding failure without suing them. Tell us how you'll capture and learn from failure. Tell us how you'll have a prompt and agile response to failure, and tell us how you'll contain and isolate failure. Now we have fancier names for them, and we have a big framework that walks them through some of the design choices. We don't want to make a brittle PCI checklist because that doesn't work for even highly replaceable credit cards. In fact, a lot of them think that, well, eventually we'll aspire to be as good as PCI. And I said, guys, we spend $80 billion a year protecting credit cards. It's an abject failure. The reason it's still in place and still the common approach is there is because a 4% annual fraud rate is acceptable. I mean, they only reinvest when the fraud rate goes above a certain acceptable range. And I challenged the room. I said, is a 4% incremental crash rate acceptable, because they're spending a lot more time and money on security than you are. And even if you get as bad as they are, if you aspire to be as bad as they are, this is a flesh and blood kind of a problem. So what do I mean by these things? The safety by design is think Microsoft's SDL, right? Tell your customers, have a public attestation that says, here are the steps that we take to keep our customers safe and their privacy data. So it's essentially a covenant between the car company and the buyer. And if it's an unimpressive one, you probably won't do business with them. And if it's a really good one, maybe you will. And this isn't yet a buyer criteria, but trust me, when there's unreliable systems demonstrated in the field, this will start to become a criteria. So Microsoft's arguably one of the better ones in the world, and they're constantly publishing their new stuff. The second one is probably clearer to you guys. Do you have a published coordinated disclosure policy saying you will not sue third-party researchers acting in good faith? And the metaphor here is, do you have a welcome mat, or do you have a beware of dog sign? And to date, the only car company, and most of the car companies don't call it a car company, to do this is Tesla. And not only do they have one, they're on version 3 of their evolution. They went from crawl to walk to run. The first one was, we won't sue you and we'll give you a challenge coin and a tour of the factory, which is very cool, by the way. Number 2, they added a $1,000 cash prize about 6 months later, which isn't enough money to pay a professional, but it's a nice gesture. And they were trying to slowly ratchet up how many bugs they got simultaneously so they could build the muscles to handle and triage these things internally. And then, if many of you saw at DEF CON, they upped it to a $10,000 prize. And I don't think they're done. I think they're experimenting like Microsoft did. But essentially, it's, you're going to get the goodwill and talent pool of the free market if you put out a welcome mat. The evidence capture, I was really, really getting indignant because you had the car companies saying there's zero evidence of any hacking in the field. And I said, you cannot cry there's zero evidence when you lack any mechanism to ever capture any evidence. It's the most circular nonsense I'd ever heard. So think like a black box, right? We don't want to spy on people's behavior or driving patterns. What we want to know is integrity and security event logging in a consistent way that's tamper evident, court admissible, just like we do for airplane crashes and trains and whatnot. So the notion of a black box, so we can actually see that for months and months and months, Chris and Charlie were tampering over the network before they had functional code. Those events are actionable in every other part of our life and could have been actionable had they been paying attention. But none of the cars really have these. Some of them have event recorders, but they're really tracking civil liberties infractions, not actually system integrity stuff. Secure updates, this was a little controversial, but we have to talk and push through it, which is that yes, adding remote update capabilities adds a remote attack surface. And it's worth it. By far, it's worth it. You just got to do it right. But you know what? We've gotten better at doing this now. We have figured out how to do these in more stable and recoverable ways. And a lot of them are afraid to do it because they think, oh, it might add a remote attack surface. And I said, you've got 12 and counting. And none of the other ones actually give you any security benefit in the form of response capacity. So whether it's your mobile phone updates or whatnot, they've got to get to a point. And at current state, Tesla has it, BMW has it, Mercedes has it. I believe Ford has announced, I know Ford has announced it, I just don't know by when they're going to put it in there. And honestly, the best way we convinced Ford was not the security benefits of a remote update, it was the cost savings. Because recalls are really expensive. In straight linear math, they're very expensive. The labor, sending out USB keys or some other update medium, notifying everybody, but also they're expensive to brand and bad news. The segmentation and isolation, I couldn't find the right way to do it, and this is the best we've come up with, so if someone has a superior way, when a compartment in a submarine floods, you don't sink the whole sub. And the problem with the modern vehicle is getting access anywhere gives you access everywhere. And this is something that we know how to fix this stuff, right? We know how segmentation, isolation, and ring architectures, and all sorts of least privilege concepts that we could help them with if we chose to. So we can celebrate fail, or some people are taking jobs inside of these auto companies or inside of medical device companies. Kaz was one of the first ones. He did it before it was fashionable. He went right into the belly of Tesla. And a lot of other people have done more since then. Mike Murray left Mad Security, his own company, to go inside of General Electric medical devices to fix stuff from within. And he's hiring a whole bunch of our friends to revamp and modernize their SDL so that we can have more defensible medical devices. And we can bring some of our talent to this. This is not so foreign and exotic that we can't really transfer our knowledge. If we know how to be good blue teamers and secure architects, we can do this. So instead of celebrating the failure at BMW, earlier in February they got hacked. A third party brought them this. They fixed it over the air. We said, this is a success story, guys, right? So somebody that didn't work for them brought them a bug. It was a consortium in Germany. They had over-the-air update capabilities, so they fixed it silently before a single adversary was alerted to the weakness. So it was a faster recall than the Jeep will ever be, because the Jeep is still at about under 50% last time I checked for people fixing it, and maybe forever. It was also more pervasive, right? So faster and more pervasive. And in the process of updating it, someone else pointed out that they were pushing their updates over the air in the clear. So they modified their design to start using SSL. So I think this is actually a good story, and we wanted to celebrate what they're doing right in the context of those 5 stars, right? The third-party collaboration, they improved their SDL in the process, they did a secure over-the-air update. There was zero advantage to adversaries to take advantage of this. And I'm sure they're going to mess up again, but at least they were prepared for the failure. And very little news coverage about it, because they didn't have to do recalls like the Jeep. So if you think about Microsoft, I would say that they're probably the best in the world for their bug bounty programs. They continue to experiment. It's not just because they throw the most money at it, but they had the Blue Hat Conference, they had the Blue Hat Prize, they had greater prizes for defensive and counter evasion techniques. They pay 6-figure checks to some of us who come up with something really valuable to making their products safer. Katie actually started experimenting towards the end, and they're still doing it, where they would pay more money during beta than they would after a GA to start manipulating the dark market on who was going to report bugs sooner instead of exploiting them for 6 months first. So really rich, robust, continuous practice to try to make this better. And one of the things I told the automakers is, guys, you have about 10 million lines of code and growing. And if Microsoft's the best in the world at SDL for modern rigor for how to their software development lifecycle, and number 2, they're the best in the world at bug bounty programs, they're still fixing a dozen or more critical and severe vulnerabilities per month. And they have 1/10 of the lines of code that you do. So if you think you're going to be immune, that the Charlie Crist type hacks are going to be once a year, you're going to be in for a rude awakening. All we've been lacking is the attacker bug density. The bugs are there, the research attack focus is not in there. If you know a lot of the car hackers that aren't the ones that talk on stage, each one of them has several dozen bugs they've found and are working to get remediated. Stefan Savage and Yoshi, it finally came to light. They finally got one of the GM ones fixed after 5 years. It's not that the car company wasn't trying. It's that they lacked any robust, reliable way to update that old chassis and the old tech package. It took 5 years to fix. So there's a lot more of these than you're seeing in the news, because the people that are deeply concerned about public safety aren't about to advertise to bad guys how to, here's a big kick me son. Now, one of the bigger issues as well is we keep poking at flaws in the older designs that can't really be fixed well. And when they look at the old stuff, their first instinct is to buy aftermarket security stuff. And I really hope we don't have to go buy a Norton antivirus or a McAfee antivirus for every single car we buy. And I really, really hope we don't have to get a Cisco IDS and IPS aftermarket or a UTM for our car. And of course, there's going to be some sort of bolt-on forever. But we know built-in is superior to bolt-on. And what we really want to do is put the heavy burden on making sure these systems are architected to be defensible instead of throwing $80 billion of aftermarket security onto our cars. So we tend to get wrapped around the axle, and I don't mean that deliberately as a pun, that we focus so much on the sunk cost of the cars in the field that we really don't move the needle on making the future designs less stupid. So at least for our part, we're much more focused on future design architecture choices as opposed to lamenting what's already in the field. The sort of good news is the older the car is and the less connected it is, the less qualitative attack surface that is. The one game changer, though, is all these aftermarket OBD2 port tech packages that make your dumb car a smart car. They're really, they're getting unfettered access to pretty much everything. So that we're getting a little less comfortable with that. So the thing that really got them was, I finally put this up on the screen in Detroit, and I didn't really explain what it was, and I just kind of let it fester for a little bit. Anybody recognize this? That's right. And you know how long it was on the news for, unremediated?
6 weeks.
It was pretty long. It was agonizingly long, right? It was terrible. And we know that how much money they've paid thus far in total cleanup dollars? I think I've heard it's like 30-something billion. And that was about in April. So what I was pointing out isn't so much that one of them is going to go out of business or anything like that. I said, it's basically a poorly kept secret that most of them have a remote kill switch, and most of them implemented the remote kill switch using vulnerable open source code, and most of them can't fix that vulnerable open source code in the systems that they've done it in. So I said to them, if you're the one that gets millions of your vehicles disabled simultaneously and you're on the news, what's your best case response time to fix that? And one of them said, after like 30 seconds of silence, he said, let's face it, the 2018s are already done. So his best answer was the 2018 models. And then someone else said, well, geez, the third-party tech packages we use, they're done through 2020. So if we can't patch it or fix it, we're going to have to pull those vehicles. This is not a great response time, right? And this is something that we can help them with. Now, but here's where I turn it to us, right? Who saw that United published a bug bounty program? Who made fun of their bug bounty program? There was a lot to make fun of, right? So they essentially dipped their toe in the water, in the vulnerability disclosure water. And we were a bunch of rabid piranhas, and we gnawed that toe to a bone, right? We were very vicious. And what we don't see or hear about much is there was actually another airline company and another automotive company about to do one that week as well, and they canceled them because we were so vicious and negative. And I understand why people were upset. There's some legitimate gripes, right? There were direct logic flaws in there. They said, you can't do brute force, and you can use fuzzers, but you can't brute force, or something like that. And 50% or more of the language sounded like, if you do this, we'll sue you. If we do this, you'll sue you, So it wasn't written in a very friendly way. But damn, was it a good idea that they're starting to realize they wanted help from third-party researchers. So one of the things I'd like to tell us is, could we have a change of heart, and could we bring a little bit more patience to this and realize that while we've been having this disclosure war for 20 years, they're in year one for most of them. And they don't have an entrenched negative opinion like Oracle does. They don't have an opinion. They're hearing that security could compromise their customers. They're starting their journey, and I would love us to have a more welcoming attitude to encourage a crawl, then a walk, then a run, much like Tesla did, right? They started with just recognition, then they did slight small reward, et cetera. So back to Tesla, right? They did not offend the sensibilities because they had some hackers on staff who helped them with the language, but they didn't start off with a 6-figure cash prize like Microsoft did. But they are setting the tone for, we want lots of bugs found, and they have found a lot of bugs. A good chunk of the bugs, if you corner them, they already knew about. They're still paying the prize, but what it's done for their management team is to say, hey, all these things you told us wouldn't manifest, people keep finding them, so we should probably up the priority to fix them. And they're finding a good way to cast a wider net to find enough bugs and make things safer sooner. It's also impacting their design choices on a go-forward basis, because when they see enough bugs in a certain category, they realize, is there a smarter way to lop off this entire category? And the answer often is yes. And then there's some of the ones that don't get as much headlines, but we announced this at our B-Sides Las Vegas. We had a Cavalry Day. And over the web, live, the first medical device manufacturer that we know of happens to be in Germany. It's not like a huge one, but the first public coordinated disclosure policy asking for help from third-party researchers was announced from Draeger. And what we're doing is working with the Food and Drug Administration to make sure that for the modern guidance, that maybe you should have to have a coordinated disclosure policy based on ISO standards. Notice I've been saying coordinated, not the nasty R word, but this is a good sign, right? These guys who don't have a pedigree in hacking culture recognize the value that comes from your talent pool and want a collaborative way to do it instead of this combative model that we have from Oracle. So I'm probably going to skip this in the interest of time. Does anybody know what this picture is? Okay. I'll come back to it. It's the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. So, it's been a tough slog to work through these closed cultures. So even though Tesla has one, and I was celebrating that Draeger is the first to add one for medical, they don't consider, the auto industry does not consider Tesla a car company. They hate Tesla. But finally, without any legal mandatory need for this came out just a couple weeks ago. GM finally announced they're close to publishing their coordinated disclosure policy. And when someone from Detroit, a traditional car maker, does this, they'll be seen as a leader, and they will have to be copied and emulated. So the same effect that makes everybody want to copy the 4G LTE mistake is the same kind of phenomenon that's going to trigger some of this. So we might be at the cusp of getting the traditional players to open up a little bit more than they traditionally have. I think it's going to be closer to the United program than it is going to be the Tesla program. But I'm asking this group to see it as a baby step on a crawl and then walk and then run. And let's celebrate what's right with it instead of poking fun of all the things wrong with it. Now, the bigger win has been, it turns out that even though we got a later start with the medical devices, we've had a bigger success. And if you get me fired up enough, I'll probably say this more later today in the hallway, but people took a very bad lesson from the Chris and Charlie attacks. They thought unless you do something dramatic and sensational on a highway and put people in danger, no one will ever fix anything. And that was their talk track through Vegas. And I'm friends with both of them, but we came to tussle on this because several people in Washington and the people that we've been working with to try to decriminalize research through DMCA changes, through CFAA changes, they looked at that as reckless endangerment. They have thrown the word felony around. They're saying that we're making it impossible for our advocates in Washington to help us decriminalize research because people are scared. And the first thing they turn to is the scary people, not the hackers or the car companies. They're not saying Jeep should have done better. There's some people that said that. They're saying we've got to criminalize research. In fact, I don't know if you saw this, but I think we've shot it down. But on Friday, this bill came out of nowhere attached to the Highway Act that tried to add more financial penalties to people tampering with cars, even if they own them. So, this is a climate where people don't understand how necessary third-party collaboration is and how necessary our talent pool is for public safety and public good. And we have to be very careful so that we look like a helping hand instead of a pointing finger, and we look at a part of the solution as opposed to a part of the problem. So what didn't get as much coverage this same week is, does anybody know about the Hospira drug infusion pump hack that Billy Rios did? So he found a flaw that was remote execution could dump the contents of a generic infusion pump in hospitals bedside. He took over 300, I think on day 400 of trying to collaborate, some other person found the same bug in Canada and dropped it. So that trigger got the Food and Drug Administration to finally listen to us with new ears, and we've been doing lots of workshops with them. And their prior position was, we cannot take action on security weaknesses until there is proof of harm. And proof of harm means actual linkage and evidence to patient death or dismemberment or whatnot. And what we tried to point out to them is, because there's no forensic evidence capture required, back to the 5-star idea, you will never trigger that condition. And we said, when you have a clear and present danger, a reliable exploitable flaw, there's no mitigation path, what can be done about it? So the day before we all flew to DEF CON, they issued their first ever safety communication, essentially saying, the FDA strongly encourages healthcare facilities to begin transitioning to alternative infusion systems as soon as possible. They don't have a fix for their model until December, and this went out the 1st of August. So they're going to lose pretty much 100% of their install base to their competitors, because any hospital continuing to use this against FDA advice, if something goes bad, they're going to be sued into oblivion. So what we've helped to set precedent on by using empathy and by using translation of our words into their world, they finally found a way to translate their existing regulatory framework to say an unmitigated pathway to harm is as good as proof of harm. And this sets a really clear signal to everybody that if someone has a remote code execution and you can't patch it, it's going to have serious financial implications. Now, this is not coming through Billy's elite hack source skills, right? I mean, it could have been anybody's attack here. It was helping to translate, how does a large government bureaucratic organization avoid over-regulating a space but interpreting existing things? And it took 9 months of talking this through to get to this point. And we're not done yet. And now they're actually becoming staunch advocates for people having coordinated disclosure programs, because they're seeing how vitally important it is to have help from third parties. A lot of the device manufacturers in the medical world have 11 employees or less, 11. So we tend to think of Johnson & Johnson or GE or Medtronic, these megacorps. Most of the innovative medical device technologies start with a small project out of an academic program. In fact, did you know a tongue depressor is a medical device? A wooden tongue depressor is an FDA-approved medical device.
I love the audience on that side.
The what?
The audience is awesome.
Yeah.
Risk manager.
Yeah.
Never seen that before.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah, oh, the audience. There you go. Risk managers, oncologists, nurses, right?
Never seen that.
Right. So, you know, there's a lot of places we could take this. But I think we have to stop watching what's happening with the public safety debate and start contributing to it. And we have the talent that can do so. So here's just a couple tiny examples before I completely run out of time. A lot of these guys are saying, Josh, we're trying to do security. We're doing our best. And I reminded them, I love the way this came out of my mouth. It was an accident, but it really works, right? I call it the stages of SSL. And for a lot of these guys, stage 0 was, what the heck is SSL? They didn't even know what we were talking about. So they can tell me they're trying to do security, but they weren't doing any sort of encrypted communication. The second one is you architected it wrong, right? You tried to do it, you just got it wrong. And if you remember Firesheep, it was demonstrating that, yeah, you're encrypting the tunnel after you pass the username and password in the clear. And I mean, it took Firesheep being a plugin in Firefox for people to notice what Rob Graham had presented at Black Hat 3 years prior. But it worked, and that was just an example of you meant to do it right, you just architected it wrong. And then there's what Apple and HTTP client did, which is you architected it correctly, but you implemented it wrong, right? We have bugs in our code, we have timing issues, right? So those became another way you can fail. And then with things like Heartbleed, we hate the logo, but this is a powerful lesson. You architected it correctly, you implemented it correctly. The library was bad, right? So unless you're keeping up with the freshest of ingredients, it doesn't matter how much you try. It's not your fault, but it's still your problem. And then sometimes, rarer, sometimes we break the crypto. Right? A lot of these systems were implemented a long time ago, and they're going to need to modernize. So what's one thing we could do? I love these responses to OpenSSL. OpenSSL is bloatware. It's huge. The Heartbleed name comes from the fact that someone added a heartbeat function because he didn't want to have to do the handshake to understand state. In fact, people, back to our keynote this morning about intoxication levels and whatnot, while coding, the guy introduced the bug at like 3 a.m. on New Year's Day. That's the part of the story no one ever covers. Like, friends don't let friends code a drink and code, drink and commit. But I love the response of boring SSL. It's a much, much slimmed down thing. It's not, I don't know how many security people were involved in it. I'm hoping it got a real good secure architecture design. But it was essentially just a slimmer, less complex, more strack alternative. Same thing with LibreSSL. And this past week in San Francisco, I found out that Amazon's written their own, and it's a terrible name, but it's signal to noise, or S2N. And right now it's just for SSL. But why wouldn't maybe some of us, instead of lamenting the fact that cars and medical devices have wildly vulnerable open source code and often in unpatchable implementations, why don't some of us put our heads together and create alternative series of core libraries that are safer? Or could we maybe volunteer some of our time to some of these existing projects to do some code analysis, or to do some suggested changes, or to do some hardening? Because ultimately we know this, right? More code, more problems. I wasn't going to put it in there, and then somebody was wearing this t-shirt today, so I had to put it in there. There you go. All right. But you know, this is the transition to the DevOps stuff very, 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 very briefly. So one of the reasons I love the DevOps culture is we have a lot of cultural common ground, and we can do injection points. They have this notion of technical debt, and Gene likes to use this picture as a visual manifestation of technical debt in a wiring closet. Like all debt, debt compounds over time, right? Much like bloated SSL. This is actually why I changed my day job to Sonatype, because they're the custodians of the largest open source repository in the world, and this is not just an ugly picture. This is a direct visual manifestation of all the transitive dependencies in all the Java code in the world. It's a mess, guys. And the closer you look, the messier it gets. So what's happening is, to go faster, we don't really write software anymore. We assemble it from third-party code. 90% or more of a modern application is third-party libraries. We hardly write anything anymore. So all that static and dynamic analysis we're doing on the code we write is 10% or less now. So what I want to do is, if you think about the motivations of development and operations people, or car manufacturers, or medical device manufacturers, is they don't want to be secure. They want to be on time, they want to be on budget, they want acceptable quality. So can we find ways to inject that in there? So this is one of the things we're using to help these guys go from waterfall to agile goats in a tree. You know, the reason they went from waterfall to agile is it made them faster, right? Agile and continuous integration it compressed the cycle times of dev and test and QA. DevOps took agile for everybody else and it made it, okay, we're gonna do continuous deployment as well. We're gonna pull in the operations part because we were making shelfware really, really quickly, but we weren't able to deploy value. So what I'm suggesting is that instead of just mocking the car companies, we learn from the car companies. They're really, really good at supply chain management. So part of the pitch behind Regular DevOps isn't to like write perfect code. It's that if we could use fewer and better suppliers or open source projects in our code, and we use their most, the freshest of ingredients from those fewer suppliers. So don't use a 6-year-old version of Bouncy Castle or of Struts 2. Use the most recent, least vulnerable versions. And you track which parts go where. You're gonna have less unplanned, unscheduled work for developers. You're gonna have fewer service interruptions for ops people. You're gonna have faster time to market for your business people. You're gonna have faster mean time to identify and repair when things go wrong. It took DHS 6 weeks to find which systems were affected by Heartbleed. 6 weeks. Whereas if they knew which parts had gone where, it might have taken 6 minutes. So the idea is, can we extend DevOps even more with the ideas of software supply chain rigor? And people like Nick and people like James Wickett and others, we're growing a tribe of these people. We're using the word rugged because it's less scary than security. Security is a cost, it's an inhibitor, it's friction. So the DevOps tribe likes the idea that, wait a second, if you guys could give us better hygiene in our supply chain or better coding style guides or better commented code or the parts of our trade that actually make them better at what they care about, they'll do it. There will still be parts of security that suck. There will still be parts of security that are hard. Incident response is something you're not going to be able to easily get rid of. But we can lead with things that they see as valuable. All right. Now, just one quick thing since I'm almost out of time. This is some of the Toyota supply chain principle in action without security at all. But to take those 3 principles, the Toyota Prius head-to-head with the Chevy Volt in this book, 61% of the price, so it cost less money. 13 times as many units sold, so it did better in the market. But here's the best part. One of the reasons they had such a low price point and high quality is they only made about half as much of their own car as Chevy did, and they did it with a fraction of the total suppliers. So they had fewer suppliers and they made better use of them. 125 suppliers versus 800. So if you were to translate this into too many open source projects of too low a code quality level, think Takata airbags, right? A bad batch of Takata airbags. We also could have faster, better, more productive code. And what we're doing is we're Trojan horsing in massive reduction in elective attack surface and elective risk. So when I see, as the custodian of Maven Central, I see 18 billion downloads, or 17 billion in close last year and counting. And I see an attacker trend where instead of attacking a bespoke application at Capital One or Bank of America, they all targeted Apache Struts because everybody was using it. So a flaw in Apache Struts means I get every bank instead of a flaw in their SQL injection of this one form. So I get a forced amplification. And as such, all of them got a letter in July 2013 from the FBI saying you've been compromised. Now, the one that bugs me the most, by the way, wasn't the Heartbleed stuff or even Apache Struts, it's Bouncy Castle. And if you don't know this library, please go check what version of Bouncy Castle they're using. It's a crypto library. Its actual full name is the Legion of the Bouncy Castle Cryptography APIs for Java, but let's just call it Bouncy Castle. In 2007, it had a CVSS10 full remote code execution flaw. You could basically reverse out the keys. And in 2007, they promptly fixed it because it's written by security guides for security uses. And despite that, we're still seeing 4,000 organizations in 2013 downloaded the broken one. So this is a known problem, a fixed problem that no one's taking it. And it's ending up in hundreds of thousands of applications, including bank stuff, defense contractor stuff, major social media platforms. So please go home and check your Bouncy Castle. All right, I was going to do a data viz, but I don't think the resolution looked too good, so please go see me afterwards. But I have a way to quantify how expensive this is. Essentially, if you didn't see Derek's talk yesterday, we tried to analyze thousands and thousands of applications in the market today. We found the average application has 106 third-party parts in it, Even though you think you only picked 50, those 50 pick a bunch of other stuff. Number two, we found 23% of them have a critical or high known vulnerability in them, and it only takes one. And we also found about 8% of them have a restrictive license. And because of that, any one of those things could trigger unplanned, unscheduled work, lost productivity, some service interruption for your e-commerce site. And what we've been doing, especially at DevOps last week, we got a keynote with the guys from Docker. We showed that if you have even as few as 1,000 applications, 100 applications, you're wasting about $6 million a year in unplanned, unscheduled work. So instead of convincing them that the sky is falling, there's lions and tigers and bears, what we're doing is showing that better better supply chain hygiene, even at 100 apps, can save $6 million. And a lot of them have 2,000 apps or 6,000 apps. So we're talking about significant boosts in productivity and cost savings is what they care about. And what I care about is we're dramatically eliminating remotely exploitable code. So there is a push that you're going to see, and this is the last thing I'll say. Hackers hate government, right? But some of the technical staffers are doing something smart. There's a bill from Chairman Royce in California that's called the Cyber Supply Chain Transparency Act. And it's basically saying anything sold to the government has to provide a bill of materials of the third-party and open source software used with their version numbers. Number two, they shouldn't have known security defects without a written justification. And number three, because future vulnerabilities are inevitable, your goods must be patchable. So pretty soon, if you want to sell a car to the Secret Service or Border Patrol, or if you want to sell medical advice to Veterans Affairs, you're going to have a bill of materials, good hygiene in it, and must be patchable. So the two little words to take away that I think are our best chance for us to drive good patterns into the Internet of Things are known vulnerabilities. And if you need any proof at all, this is the best thing I've ever seen, which is that in the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, they said 97% of last year's successful attacks were tracked to just 10 CVEs. No 0 days, no Chinese APT kitten killers, 10 known CVEs, 8 of which have had a patch available for more than 10 years. So I'm not going to crap on anybody who's looking for O-days. O-days are awesome. But what I would love us to do is if we want to help make the IoT safer, we want to make our cars and medical devices safer, let's get them used to finding, avoiding, responding to, learning from failure. And let's start with this massive, massive backlog of known vulnerabilities in the software supply chain. So I'm going to skip that. So I don't know what your motivations are, but I hope that you are. And I believe that no matter what your talent pool or how you got started, that if we're going to be better at things that affect public safety and human life, that affect seeing the research community as a necessary contributor to public safety and public good as opposed to scary people we need to criminalize. The answer is going to be taking what we know and the talents that we have and putting them into areas where we demonstrate actual value to the public. And not only will you be safer for your family, but you'll also have the freedom of movement to continue doing the profession that you love in the way that you love to do it. So I thank you for your time, and there you go.